Here's part 3. This was much harder to write than I thought it would be. I'll post my conclusions in the morning. I'm exhausted now. I hope you enjoy. Despite Woody's concerns for our safety, he agreed to let us try again, and our third and what would be final probe into the mystery of Woody's haunting began with dinner at a restaurant in Warrenton by the name of Tibby's Taco House. Woody drove up and joined us. The place had pretty good food. We discussed the events of the previous 2 weeks in great depth. It was plain to all of us that whatever we were dealing with had a particular affinity for females, and we were willing to take Woody at his word when he said the phenomena was heaviest in the early spring. Certainly, we hadn't been disappointed so far. Attempts had been made to research the property prior to Woody's ownership. It was indicated that the house that currently stood was at least the second time the site had been built on, probably more than that. We had no evidence of a death or anything heinous having occurred there, however. Basically a dead end. So, we just sat down and put logic to work. What had happened in this area over the past few hundred years? Our first thought, of course, was the Civil War. We weren't far from Manassas, where 2 battles had been fought. A little further in the other direction was Fredericksburg, another major battle site. There are numerous markers along the major roads in our area, with little historical tidbits about armies that passed through on their way to this battle or that. Undoubtedly, there was plenty of conflict and plenty of death in the history of our region. We had experiences with the Civil War ghosts before, so it wasn't a stretch to consider that we had another. We thought about the Underground Railroad as well. Perhaps the ground the house was built on once held a way stop, and something bad happened. There was probably a Native American presence in the area in the earliest days, and there was always the possibility it was an elemental or worse, a demon. In other words, we didn't really know. To this day, we still don't, though the events of this third and final night helped us narrow it down considerably. Kevin and I tried to convince the girls that they weren't going down this time. We argued about the apparent danger, and we reminded them of the effects the previous 2 weeks had had on them. But they invoked the power of the vagina and won the day. It was decided that all 4 of us, along with Woody himself, would descend that night. We geared up, 4 lanterns, 4 cameras, and our 1 surviving recorder. Woody had a few flashlights on hand should we need them. We waited till dusk and searched the premises. All was well except for our batteries, which were once again dead. I came pretty close to calling the whole thing off when we discovered that. I've had a very active ghost hunting career, but I've never experienced 3 encounters in 3 weeks. Not once before this incident, and not once since. For at least a few minutes on this final night, I really didn't want to go through it all again. But my ambition and love for my hobby kept my mouth shut. It was too good of an opportunity to let pass. We descended the steps, single file. And halfway down, all 4 of our lanterns sputtered and died. Momentary panic set in until Woody, who was bringing up the rear, turned back and flicked the light switch over the steps. We retreated to the top floor where no amount of shaking or fiddling could get the lanterns lit again. These types of lanterns aren't battery powered. They have a bulb that lasts so long, and then you toss the thing and buy a new one. They're cheap. Unfortunately, all 4 of ours had just died, to the tune of about $80. They're not cheap in bulk, damn it. And we were reduced to Woody's flashlight collection. Once we sorted that mess out, we descended the steps again, acutely aware that we were not welcome. We all had a very uneasy feeling that night. It felt like all bets were off, and the dead lanterns seemed to be a challenge, or a warning. Woody stood near the rack with the biggest flashlight. Sarah and I sat on the sawhorses, while Kevin and Jenna waited near the steps. Each of us pairs had a flashlight between us. We had decided that we wouldn't allow the girls to get more than a step away from the guys, and that we would frequently speak to them to make sure they weren't being fucked with. They related their feelings immediately. Dread, anger, resentment. Jenna told us the basement felt different to her this time though. Very melancholy. She was convinced that something tragic had happened here, but couldn't tell if it was a malicious tragedy, an accident, or what. As I've mentioned though, she makes no claim to being psychic, and says that she was just interpreting what she felt. We waited in the dark, We made some small talk now and again, mostly just checking up on the girls and asking for their feelings. Nothing happened for about the first 2 hours. At that point, we first heard the faint tapping. It came from the same place as the previous times, and again, we lit the area and saw nothing. We took a bunch of pictures that would show us nothing when developed. The tapping faded away after about 20 minutes, and the minutes dragged by. Jenna and Sarah maintained that they were in control of themselves, though they felt emotional disturbance very intensely. As for us guys, we felt nothing but creeping dread on the back of our necks. I'd say another hour passed, putting us past midnight into Sunday morning, May 19th. 2 quick taps preceded a sudden, and I mean fucking sudden, drop in temperature. That was immediately followed by a loud thump, right next to where Kevin and Jenna stood. It sounded like something heavy jumping off the steps onto the basement floor. Kevin and Jenna, thoroughly freaked, backpedaled to the sawhorses where Sarah and I stood. All 3 flashlight beams immediately blazed out at the bottom of the steps, and just as quickly, dimmed to the point of barely providing any illumination at all. This was probably the most oh fuck moment I've ever had in my life up to that point. Something else would top it a few seconds later though. We all began babbling at once. We were all in the dark, it was freezing cold, and there was something fucking around with our flashlights. I raised my voice, telling everyone to shut up and hold still. Let's carry this through to the end and blah blah blah. What I wanted to do was fucking bolt, but I held my ground, so did the rest of them. We heard the sound of dragging feet. I hadn't heard it prior to this, and it gave me the impression of someone in a great deal of pain, slowly slogging his or her way across the basement. It moved with agonizing slowness. A 3-legged turtle could have moved faster. Of course, time always slows down during an oh fuck moment, so maybe my perception was just screwed up. Kevin jerked Jenna back over near the stairs to watch and listen. I could hear them and the others breathing very heavily beneath the ground. It followed the same path Kevin had described it taking, from the steps across the first half of the basement, to the rack. Woody still had some of his badass marine in him, and he held his ground as it went right past him, through the opening to the second half where the sawhorses were. Sarah and I were pretty much rooted to the spot we were in, even with this thing bearing down on us. We stared in the direction it was coming from, the pitiful remnant of our flashlight barely illuminating the space a foot in front of us. It shuffled up next to us, and I don't want to say it materialized, because it didn't. It was just there. It had clear, distinct legs, colourless as a ghost's tend to be, I guess, but not transparent like some supposedly are. It wore what I can only call old-timey looking shoes, with socks or stockings that ended just below the knee. Above that was just whiteness. I got the impression that it was covered in a sheet, or perhaps wrapped in a cloak or a cape. One thing is for sure though, it had a hugely swollen belly. I think it was very, very pregnant. At chest level, it became very indistinct. It had no shoulders, neck or head. I'm not saying it had been decapitated, just that for whatever reason, it didn't manifest itself above the chest. It's hard to describe how the thing looked up top. You know how artists rough out a basic sketch of something they're drawing, then add detail and polish until it looks like it should? That's the best way to describe this thing above the chest. It was like an artist roughed it out and didn't finish it. There was no tapering where the neck should be, just white streaks that continued up, well above where the head would be. It was only there for about 5 seconds, but it really felt like an eternity. I know that's cliche to say, but it's true. I just stared at it. I was aware of how god-awful cold it was in the room, and vaguely aware of the other 4 people there with me gawking at this thing. I remember being thankful that it had no eyes, and I felt a profound sense of achievement. I'd waited my whole life to see a ghost. I'd heard plenty of them prior to this. I'd felt their presence, but I'd never seen one. It wasn't as thrilling as I thought it would be though. More than anything, I felt a deep, unrelenting sorrow for whoever this was. But behind those feelings were words of warning. Unfriendly, unclean, wrong. It faded away. Only took a couple of seconds, but it did so much slower than it appeared. Sarah and I felt something disturb the air, running past us towards the steps, but Kevin and Jenna, who were standing at the bottom of said steps, felt nothing. When it was gone, our lights blazed back to full brightness, and we fucking panicked like we've never panicked before. It played out much like the first night, except this time nobody had their heads together enough to calm the rest of us down. We ended up on the front lawn, panting and trembling, and slowly, we regained control of it. Thank you for sticking around to the end. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to leave a like. And if you want to hear more stories like it, don't forget to subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you'll never miss a story. Oh, and if you haven't already, don't forget to follow me on Twitter so you can keep up with the latest goings on the channel.